My name is Helena Park. I hold the rank of captain in the United States Air Force Logistics Command Pacific Theater. I've directed emergency extractions under active fire. I've managed aircraft drop routes during complete blackout conditions. And I've qualified as an expert marksman 3 consecutive years. People have described me in many ways. Reliable, too composed, intimidating. But no one had ever referred to me as a bride until that particular day. It was my wedding. Coronado Base, a small private ceremony beneath a canopy of string lights and a gentle breeze. My husband, Raymond Keller, wore his full SEAL dress uniform. He looked like a statue, sculpted entirely from conviction. Our guest list was small. A handful of squad mates, mutual officers, my parents, my sister Violet, and a brother I hadn't spoken with in 2 years. Well, we had just finished exchanging vows. The champagne had barely reached the rim of our flutes when I noticed it sitting on the corner table. A medium-sized gift box wrapped in textured white paper. No tag, no ribbon, only 3 words printed in small serif font. To H with love. It wasn't on the gift table. It hadn't been there during the ceremony. It wasn't there when I passed that exact spot less than 10 minutes before. I reached toward it without thinking. Instinct, maybe habit. Raymond caught my wrist midair. Don't touch it. I turned to him, startled by the tension in his voice. Why not? He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scanned the perimeter like someone had just triggered a silent alarm. Then his voice dropped. Cool, precise like steel sliding through velvet. You brought a threat into my home. My breath caught. I looked at him, then followed his gaze. He wasn't watching the box anymore. He was staring directly at Violet, my younger sister, who stood near the makeshift bar, swirling her wine glass with a faint smirk on her lips. That smirk vanished when 4 of Raymond's SEAL teammates, men I'd barely exchanged words with, rose to their feet in perfect unison. They said nothing. They didn't have to. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. The chatter faded like someone had turned the volume down on the entire room. Violet's eyes shifted to the box, then back to Raymond. And for the first time in years, I saw it. Fear, real, unpolished, involuntary. Not the kind you perform to get attention. The kind that tells you someone wasn't supposed to notice yet. I looked at Raymond again. His eyes hadn't moved. Who sent that? I whispered. I think you already know, he replied. I did. And the unsettling part was that I wasn't even surprised. Raymond gave a slight nod, and one of his teammates, Evans I believe, stepped forward. He was dressed formally like the rest of the team, but his movements were anything but ceremonial. He scanned the box, passed a handheld detector around it, then carefully lifted it with both hands and carried it toward the secured admin office adjacent to the chapel. No drama, no announcement, just protocol. The reception stumbled. A few guests exchanged awkward glances, but no one raised questions. Not in front of that many medals. I glanced back toward Violet. She was gone. She must have slipped out while everyone's attention was on the box. My stomach turned. Raymond returned to my side and said nothing. He didn't need to. His hand found mine and held it, not with warmth, but with precision, the way you anchor someone down. Helena, he said, low enough that only I could hear. You remember 4 months ago when Violet called late at night? You put her on speaker. I nodded slowly. She was in tears. Said she was caught up in some financial trouble. Wanted you to store certain documents for a couple of weeks. You declined. She begged. You still said no. I had, but it hadn't felt like a victory. Just another boundary I hoped she wouldn't test again. Raymond exhaled through his nose. I think that box is her plan B. A chill ran down my spine. Plan B, the fallback in case I hadn't gone along. Deliver it directly to the wedding when I'm distracted, vulnerable, surrounded by people, incapable of processing or reacting without creating a scene. It was tactical, and it wasn't Will's style. It was hers. The calculated drama, the timing, the watching eyes. She wanted it to arrive when I couldn't refuse. Or worse, when refusing would mean ruining my own moment. I stepped aside and pulled out my phone, texted Violet. Where did you go? No response. I scrolled through her older messages. A dozen from the preceding months. Harmless on the surface. Harmless unless you understood the subtext. The passive-aggressive apologies, the half-formed requests, the careful way she wrapped guilt in affection. I just want to be part of your new life. Can I send a little something your way soon? Just trust me. You've always been the strong one. That phrase again. I turned toward Raymond. She's trying to make it appear as though I'm involved. He nodded. That's why I stopped you from touching it. But why today? He studied me for a long moment. Because today they believed you'd let your guard down. Today you're a bride, not an officer. I felt the corners of my mouth tighten. Not a smile, not rage, just something colder. We'll see about that, I said. I turned toward the admin room where the box was now under armed observation. One way or another, I was going to find out what Violet had tried to slip into my life. Dressed up as a wedding gift. And for the first time all day, I wasn't thinking about vows. I was thinking about war. The thing about family is they know precisely where your armor is thinnest. Raymond once asked me whether I thought my brother was dangerous. I told him no. Well, wasn't violent, wasn't unpredictable in the ways the military trained us to anticipate. But that was exactly the problem. He was too predictable. Predictably selfish, predictably manipulative, predictably persuasive whenever he needed something. He served for 5 years. Army Quartermaster Corps, discharged after a quiet investigation into missing base property and falsified delivery manifests. The official file reads dishonorable discharge due to administrative misconduct. The unofficial story: he was caught rerouting military-grade equipment to off-the-books buyers. He never went to prison. He never even offered an apology. Well, claimed he'd been set up. Said his CEO didn't like him. Said the system was rigged against people trying to get ahead. He always had an explanation. I remember one call a few months after his discharge. I was stationed at Hickam mid-rotation, buried in end-of-quarter inventory. He said he needed my help. Just a PayPal account in your name, he said. Temporary. I can't use mine while they freeze my funds for review. You know how slow the system is. I hesitated, but he was ready for that. He always was. Told me he'd never ask for anything else. Said I was the only one in the family with any real standing left. Said I was stable. That word again, stable. It always carried the same meaning in my family. Useful. I didn't say yes, not out loud. But I didn't say no fast enough either. A week later, I discovered he'd created the account anyway, using my name, my email, an old address from when I lived off base in Georgia. He sent me a text. Don't worry, sis. Nothing shady. Just using your name to keep things above board. That contradiction haunted me for months. If it wasn't shady, why couldn't he use his own? I could have reported him, could have shut it down, but I didn't. I told myself it would pass, that he'd delete it once he was finished. Instead, I buried it. I never told Raymond. Not until now. We were in the car. Leaving the base after the wedding was cut short. The sunset over the bay looked like spilled copper. Raymond broke the silence first. Your brother ever borrow your name before? I didn't answer immediately. The silence was my answer. He sighed, one hand on the wheel, one tapping his wedding band against the steering column. That wasn't temporary, he said. That was a blueprint. I turned to him. He used it again. He never stopped. You think people like will ever quit when the first test run succeeds? I felt the weight of something I tried to forget folding in on itself. The truth I'd buried had grown roots. Raymond parked the car outside our house. He didn't shut off the engine. He didn't need your permission this time, he said. Just your pattern. That stayed with me. My pattern. Because it didn't just exploit my trust. He memorized how I forgave. How I froze when guilt was used as a weapon. How I never wanted to cause a scene, especially in front of people I'd have to salute the following day. He knew I wouldn't open that box in front of guests. He knew I wouldn't file charges without proof. He counted on my restraint. I stepped out of the car and walked directly to the filing cabinet in the corner of our den. Third drawer, old documents, sealed records, scanned tax returns. There was an email thread from 2 years ago. He had asked for a copy of my W-2 just to help compare deductions. I'd sent it. No watermark, no encryption, just a PDF. And that was the first domino. I printed it again, placed it on the counter beside our coffee pot. Raymond joined me, picked it up, scanned the subject line. He's not careless, I said quietly. He's calculating. He plays the long game. One name, one favor, one borrowed file at a time. Raymond nodded. He plays small until he gets big enough to disappear. We stood there in silence. Two veterans side by side, not on a battlefield, but in our own kitchen, tracing the breadcrumbs of betrayal. And for the first time in years, I felt something heavier than shame. I felt ready. I didn't sleep that night, not because of adrenaline or fear, but because my mind kept cycling through possibilities. At 0600 the next morning, I walked into the NCIS office on base. The agent in charge, Special Agent Nichols, had already received the box from the admin team. He was calm, methodical, and courteous, but his eyes never warmed. He sat me down in a small room with a metal table and a single manila folder. He slid it toward me. "We scanned the USB," he said. "You might want to take a look." I opened a folder. What I saw made my fingers stiffen. 3 forged invoices with my name printed at the top. A scanned image of my signature, nearly flawless, but the pressure curve was off. And then a contract dated 2 weeks prior between Helena Park Holdings and an import-export supplier based in Florida. "What the hell is this?" I asked. "That's what we're hoping you can help us determine," he replied. My eyes moved across the pages again. My name in bold, my military ID number partially redacted, even my current station code. Raymond stood behind me, silent until then. "They've been using you like a vault," he said. "Quiet, sealed, and easy to blame." I looked at him. "How did they get this information?" "You gave it to them," Raymond said. "Piece by piece. Over years, they've been accumulating your credibility." It hit me like a blow I saw coming a moment too late. That tax return from 2 years ago, the email with my military title in the footer, the copy of my lease agreement I'd sent Violet when she was establishing residency for a job application. Every favor had been a chisel, carving out the shape of a person I'd never agreed to become. I turned back to Nichols. "Can we trace the IPs that access this file?" He nodded. "Already underway, but it gets worse." He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward me. A payment ledger, a wire transfer. $10,000 routed through a checking account under H Park Holdings, sent from a shell corporation called Everbright Logistics. The funds had been used to purchase a shipment of ceramic artwork. The exact description used on the box delivered to my wedding. "This isn't just forgery," Nichols said. "This is commerce fraud. They used you as a front for a laundering operation." That box wasn't a gift. It was a delivery confirmation. I didn't speak for a full minute. It all made sense now. The timing, the smirk on Violet's face, the quiet force in Raymond's grip when he stopped me from touching the box. "Why the wedding?" I asked finally. Raymond answered for him. "Because they knew today you'd let your guard down." He wasn't accusing me. He was stating a fact. And he was right. They didn't select a random day. They chose the one day I wouldn't question a surprise. The one day people expected me to smile and nod and say thank you. They used my trust like a fuse. Agent Nichols spoke again. "We've already flagged the account. We'll freeze the assets by end of day. But you need to be prepared, Lieutenant. There's a possibility someone inside your family constructed this over time. Not impulsive, not accidental. That part one already understood." Raymond leaned in. "This is the point where most people begin to spiral," he said quietly. "But I need you to do the opposite." I looked up at him. "I'm not spiraling," I said. "I'm recalibrating." Because I wasn't just angry. I was awake. Every red flag I dismissed had become paperwork. Every delayed boundary had transformed into a weapon. Every silence had been a yes I never intended to give. They didn't just steal my name. They used it to construct a version of me that could be blamed, discredited, and discarded. All while I stood in a white dress, promising forever to the one man who had actually seen it coming. I folded the forged contract and pushed it back to Nichols. "What's the next step?" He looked impressed. "Next step, you file an official statement, claim identity fraud, and we open a federal inquiry." Raymond rested a hand on my shoulder. "You ready for that?" I nodded. I wasn't ready for the box, but I'm ready for what follows. Because this time, I wasn't going to be the vault. I was going to be the breach. I've been trained to follow trails, logistics trails, supply chains, personnel movement. I know how to trace fuel shipments across oceans and reconstruct the failure points of mission logistics. But I never imagined I'd be tracking signatures crafted to look like mine. That morning, I stood in the NCIS evidence review room with a stack of documents I'd collected overnight. Bank forms, lease agreements, military applications, anything containing my authentic signature. I placed them on the table in front of Special Agent Nichols. "I want you to have everything," I said. "Compare it all. I have nothing to conceal." He glanced at Raymond, who stood behind me like a stone wall. Then he nodded, drew the documents closer, and began working through them. "We already ran the forged signature through digital enhancement," Nichols said. "It's precise, but there's no pressure variation. It was lifted, not written." I understood what that meant. It had been scanned and digitally placed. That meant the origin point was electronic, and I had an extensive digital footprint. My heart sank as something came back to me. I reached for my phone and opened the archive folder of old emails. 6 months back, late February, an email from Violet, brief and seemingly innocent. "Hey sis, just checking in. Hope you're doing okay. I'll be sending you a few little things soon. Nothing serious. Don't worry about it. Zoxo." At the time, I hadn't responded. I was in the middle of a relocation. We had just wrapped a rotation in Guam. I barely registered the message. But now I recognized it for what it was. A prelude, a signal, not affection, but intention. She had been laying markers, constructing herself an alibi wrapped in sentiment. I showed the message to Nichols. He read it, then looked back at me. "She ever follow up on this?" "No." "Then this may be one of the earliest indicators we have." He printed it, labeled it, and placed it into the evidence sleeve. Raymond was quiet until then. "She's not careless," he said. "She just assumed we wouldn't dig this deep." He wasn't wrong. Violet had always concealed herself behind charm and just enough chaos to pass manipulation off as confusion. But this wasn't confusion. This was architecture, a deliberate fraud operation. Nichols continued working through the authentic signatures I provided. He circled 2, then turned his laptop screen to face me. He had the forged documents displayed side by side with my verified files. "You see that?" he asked. "The forged ones have no micro-staggering. Your real signatures have rhythm, slight tremors, pressure points. These don't. They're clean because they were copied." He looked up. "Lieutenant Park, you're not a suspect. You're a source." That word landed harder than I expected. Not a suspect, a source. In other words, I had become a witness to my own identity being used as a smokescreen. And it made sense. My access, my clearance, my military reputation, all of it made me the ideal cover. Not because I was corruptible, but because I was reliable. Because no one would question a Park file. Because I operated by the book. And people who operate by the book rarely notice when the book has been rewritten around them. Nichols began drafting the first official complaint to the Financial Cyber Unit. Meanwhile, I turned to my own laptop and began constructing timeline. Every message, every call, every unusual request from Violet or Will. Every moment I dismissed because I hadn't wanted to believe the worst. It was strange seeing your own name attached to something criminal. Knowing it wasn't you, but it resembled you. It felt like being framed by your own reflection. I added Violet's email to the timeline. Labeled it, Emotional Grooming Attempt. February 2nd. That's what it had been. That's what it had always been. A slow accumulation of guilt and false intimacy until you were too numb to object. Raymond produced a printed sheet he'd prepared the night before. It was a map, not of geography, but of relationships. Names, arrows, dates, red lines connecting moments and money. He pointed to a name circled near the bottom. Everbright Logistics. "That's the one we need to open up," he said. "If they're routing shipments through that label, there's a paper trail." I nodded, drew a slow breath. The investigator in me, the officer capable of reverse engineering enemy movement from a fuel manifest, was back. Only this time, the battlefield wasn't overseas. It was family, and it was personal. We weren't simply proving my innocence. We were tracing a criminal network that had been operating behind my face. And I was done being their blind spot. The deeper we dug, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't a single incident. The wedding box wasn't the first. It wasn't even the most brazen. It was just the first one that failed. 3 days into the investigation, the NCIS cyber team traced digital shipment records linked to H. Park Holdings. Most of the payments and documentation had been routed through a warehouse near Long Beach. Nothing elaborate, Just one of those industrial storage and forwarding facilities with 30 identical units and an underpaid night clerk who didn't ask questions. According to their ledger, 3 previous shipments have been processed under my name over the preceding 6 months. 1 to Nevada, 1 to Miami, 1 sent internationally to Seoul under the label ceramic display samples. Raymond and I didn't wait for authorization. We drove down that same afternoon. The facility looked like every other logistics hub I'd inspected over the years. Chain link perimeter, corrugated steel units, a front office with dusty blinds, and the scent of reheated burritos. I stepped inside while Raymond stayed in the car, coordinating with Nichols remotely. The woman behind the desk looked up. "You the one from Park Holdings?" I didn't answer directly. "I'm here about Unit 24B. I'd like to review the outbound manifest records from the last 90 days. She shrugged and handed me a printed log. Low resistance. She wasn't paid enough to care who was asking what. I worked through page after page until I found it. Date, March 3rd, sender, Helena Park Holdings. Destination, Everbright Consolidated Reno NV. Package contents, ceramic artifacts. Value, $6,400. Digital confirmation, yes. Signed for by H. Park. Scanned signature. Same forged signature. Same pattern, same shell company. But what stopped me cold wasn't the paperwork. It was the footnote in the delivery notes. Scheduled by V. Carter. Violet Carter. She hadn't even bothered with a pseudonym. I looked up at the clerk. "Do you keep CCTV footage if it hasn't been overwritten?" "Yeah, we've got a month's worth still on the drive." "Can I see March 3rd? 10 minutes later, I was watching a black and white feed on a flickering monitor. And there she was, Violet, standing in the loading bay, wearing sunglasses indoors, hair pulled into a messy bun, holding a clipboard. She spoke to the driver, gestured at the box identical in size and wrapping to the one delivered at my wedding, and smiled. That same rehearsed charm she'd perfected since high school debate team. And suddenly it clicked. All those years, I had assumed what was the dangerous one. He was reckless, impulsive. He ran schemes that collapsed as fast as they started. But this was architecture. This was staged, dressed-up sabotage in soft tones and familial signatures. The box hadn't come from Will. It came from Violet. She used my name. She used my wedding. And worse, she used my complicated history with Will to distract me from what she was orchestrating right in front of me. A subtle misdirection buried in plain sight. I'd suspected Will because he had a track record, but Violet had something different. My trust. She never needed to force her way in. She walked through while I was holding the door open. I called Raymond from the car. "It wasn't him," I said. He didn't ask who I meant. He said Violet. I nodded, even though he couldn't see. She arranged all of it, the shipments, the account. Will may have assisted, but she's the one directing things. He was quiet for a moment. That explains the smirk. I stared through the windshield, watching warehouse workers move pallets without urgency. The world kept turning as though nothing had changed except for me. I wasn't simply chasing a paper trail anymore. I was watching it burn while the arsonist held the match bearing my initials. Raymond's voice broke through my thoughts. "What do you want to do next?" I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "We start with the IP logs. Every login, every scheduled submission, every traceable click, and then we build a case not just around stolen identity, but around the deliberate sabotage of a federal officer's record." He didn't respond immediately, just breathed through the phone. "Then, you're not doing this alone." I didn't smile, but something settled into place inside me, like sliding a fresh magazine into position. The box wasn't the first, but it was going to be the last. Growing up, I believed our family operated by a certain code. Not a perfect one, but a code. You work hard. You remain quiet. You show up when it matters. You don't embarrass each other in public. And you never expose your pain where others might hear. That code carried me through basic training, through deployments, through separation and reintegration and command. But what it failed to prepare me for was betrayal from within the walls. I asked my parents to meet me the week after the investigation deepened. I didn't share everything with them. Not yet. I simply said I needed to speak with them in person. We met at a quiet diner near their neighborhood. One of those places with vinyl booths and laminated menus unchanged since 1982. The walls smelled of burnt toast, and old syrup. My mother arrived first. My father followed 5 minutes later. No embrace, just a nod from both. Their eyes moved over me the way you'd study a stranger who looked familiar. I slid the manila folder across the table. Inside, 3 shipment manifests, screenshots of forged accounts, and the image of Violet at the warehouse. My mother didn't open it. My father barely glanced at it. "We're not sure what you want us to say," my mother said quietly. I kept my voice measured. "I want to know when you found out." She hesitated. That pause conveyed more than any words could have. Finally, she spoke. "Will and Violet said you knew. They told us you had agreed months ago." I blinked. "Agreed?" She nodded. "They said it was a business arrangement, that it helped you with military logistics on the side. We didn't ask too many questions." "And that didn't strike you as strange?" My father shifted in his seat. "They told us it was classified. We thought maybe it was something covert, something you weren't permitted to discuss." I couldn't absorb what I was hearing. "You thought I was operating a fictitious corporation under my own name to run black market shipments across state lines. And your response was to nod and let it continue." My mother looked down at the table. "We didn't want to insult you." No, they hadn't wanted the discomfort of questioning the story. They hadn't wanted to risk uncovering something that might demand action. They didn't protect me. They simply hoped I'd survive the aftermath. I leaned back. My appetite had disappeared the moment I walked in, but now it was replaced by something colder. "You know what hurts?" I said. "I didn't come here to accuse. I came to find out if any part of my family could still tell the truth." My father finally looked up. "You think we knew everything?" He said. "We didn't. Maybe we should have, but we didn't." I shook my head. "You didn't ask because somewhere beneath the surface you didn't want to know. Because knowing would mean having to choose." He didn't respond. I stood. I have spent my entire life defending people who couldn't defend themselves. I've worn the flag on my chest while being questioned, dismissed, and underestimated. But I always knew my orders. I always had structure. I pointed toward the folder. But this is what happens when family chooses comfort over truth. When silence becomes the only currency. My mother reached for my hand. I pulled it back. "I'll let the investigators complete their work. I'm not here to argue anymore." There was a moment where none of us moved. Then I added, more quietly, "I would have forgiven you for being deceived. I won't forgive you for pretending it wasn't happening." I turned to walk out. My mother's voice followed me. Barely a whisper. "We thought you were stronger than this." I stopped at the door. "I am. That's why I'm walking away." And I did. Out of the diner into the dry morning air, past the row of parked cars. It was the first time in my life I understood that sometimes strength isn't remaining in the room. It's choosing to leave before someone else reshapes your story for you. I didn't need another conversation. What I needed was a reckoning, and I had just begun. The room was colder than I had expected. NCIS had converted a former admin office into an interview space. Gray walls, no windows. A single metal table bolted to the floor, as though truth couldn't be trusted to hold itself upright. I stood behind the two-way mirror for a moment before they called me in. Violet was already seated, one leg crossed over the other, arms folded, hair perfectly arranged, as though this were brunch, not a federal inquiry. But the dark circles beneath her eyes gave something away. Exhaustion, fear, perhaps the slow recognition of a hole she had dug and could no longer climb out of. I stepped in. No uniform, just plain black slacks and a white blouse. Still military, just not regulation. She looked up, and for the first time since the wedding, she said my name. "Helena." I didn't respond, just sat down across from her. A silence settled between us, dense with everything left unspoken. Then she cracked first. "You always had the strength," Violet said, her voice soft. "I thought you'd understand." Understand? That word rang like an insult. I leaned forward, keeping my tone flat. "Understand what, Violet? That you use my name, my record, my trust to run logistics scams. That you waited until my wedding day, to use a box as a delivery marker for a money trail." She didn't respond, just looked away. Her mascara was too perfect to be accidental. She had arrived prepared for drama, for pity. So I cut that off. "You thought strength meant silence?" I said that because I kept my head down and handled things, I'd handle this too. "But that's not strength." She looked back at me. Then what is strength? It means I finally speak. She blinked twice rapidly. Then the tears arrived. Not loud or theatrical, just slow, steady lines that traced the edge of her jaw before dropping. Part of me wanted to reach across the table. The older sister instinct still lived somewhere inside me, buried beneath layers of betrayal, but I didn't move. I let the silence remain. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. I was scared, she said. Well, told us we'd never make it work unless it appeared clean. And your name? It opened every door. I looked at her. Do you understand how many clearances I had to earn to carry that name? Do you know how many background checks I've passed? How many nights I spent on base while the rest of you were celebrating birthdays and promotions? She bit her lip. It was only supposed to be one shipment. I laughed. Not from humor, more like a reflex. One shipment? That was her position. You forged 3 international documents. That's a felony even without involving a federal officer's credentials. I didn't think they'd be able to trace it back to you. And yet, here we are. She looked down. For a moment, she went quiet again. Then came the question I had anticipated but still hated hearing. Can you fix it? I exhaled slowly. You want me to lie to federal investigators and claim you have my permission? She didn't say yes. She didn't need to. Her silence was the loudest thing in that room. So I told her the truth. No. Her head shot up. I can't, I said, because the moment I fix this for you, I become you. I become someone who believes silence is protection. And I've spent too many years building my integrity to surrender it now. She sniffled. Another tear fell, but I stayed where I was. You don't understand, she whispered. Well, it's already flipped. He's putting everything on me. I nodded once. Then perhaps it's time you stop being a victim of your own schemes. The door opened behind me. It was the agent signaling that time was up. I stood. Violet looked up at me again, this time with something close to pleading. Helena, please don't hate me. I held her gaze. I don't hate you, I said. I just don't trust you. And that's worse. I walked out without looking back. She could cry. She could beg. But this time, the story wasn't hers to narrate. It was mine, and I was finished letting anyone else write it for me. There is a particular kind of silence in a legal office. Not the kind born from peace, but from pressure. The walls are lined with volumes of rules, regulations, precedents, and policies, each one capable of protecting or dismantling a name, depending on how it's applied. I sat across from the senior attorney at the Naval Legal Service office, back straight, the manila folder of evidence resting between us like a loaded weapon. I had spent the preceding week assembling everything, every authentic signature, every forged one, the shipment timeline, the screenshots, the CCTV image of Violet, the digital fingerprints tracing logins made under my name from her devices. He opened the folder and adjusted his glasses. You've been thorough, Lieutenant. I've had assistance, I replied, thinking of Raymond and the NCIS team, but I needed to ensure no detail remained open to question. He worked through it methodically, page by page. I watched him scan, absorb, annotate. When he reached the final image, the security footage of Violet at the warehouse, he set down his pen and exhaled. This isn't just fraud, he said quietly. It's conspiracy, and given your active duty status, it may cross into federal endangerment. My hands rested flat on the table. I want to file formal charges, I said. Forgery, identity theft, and anything else your office determines applicable. He nodded slowly. We'll need to build a case file from the beginning, but you've already completed most of the groundwork. These documents alone are sufficient to initiate proceedings. I handed him the flash drive next. It contained video interviews, IP logs, and financial transfers linked to H Park Holdings. I had labeled everything clearly and chronologically. Years of military logistics training had taught me to think in systems, and now I was deploying that same precision to dismantle the system that had stolen my name. He plugged it in without comment. This part, I said, pressing my finger to the page holding the bank statement with my signature forged on a transfer slip. This was the hardest to confront. He raised an eyebrow. It was the one thing I believed they'd never touch, I continued. My financial record, my reputation. They could manipulate family connections. They could fabricate stories. But this was me on paper, and they made it theirs. He nodded again, more slowly this time. You'd be surprised how often betrayal arrives wrapped in familiarity. But I will say this, most people in your position never take it this far. They're too afraid of what it will cost them. I've already paid, I said, my voice firm. I paid when I walked away from my parents. I paid when I sat across from my sister in an interrogation room and watched her frame it as a misunderstanding. I paid when I woke the morning after my wedding thinking not about love, but about liability. The attorney didn't attempt to offer comfort. That wasn't his function. Instead, he gave me something more valuable. Accountability. Then let's begin, he said. We'll open an internal case with JAG, then coordinate with DOJ on the civilian charges. This won't be swift, but it will be clean. That was all I needed. Not revenge, not even an apology. Just clean lines, clear definitions. My name reattached to the truth instead of someone else's agenda. As I signed the first affidavit, I noticed my hand was steady. No tremor, no hesitation. It occurred to me then that this was how I reclaimed what they'd taken. Not through shouting, not through collapse, but through documentation, through demand, through making their betrayal an official record that could never be erased. When I finished, I looked up at the attorney. Is it unusual, I asked, that I don't feel satisfied yet? He shook his head. Justice isn't about satisfaction. It's about correction. Satisfaction comes later, when the system carries out its function. I rose to leave, tucking the now lighter folder under my arm. Outside, the base air felt different. Not gentler, just less heavy. I was no longer the person who kept her head down. I was the woman who had rewritten her own name, one document at a time. I returned to base 2 days after filing the charges. There was no memo, no formal alert, just eyes. Quiet, watchful, calculated. The kind of glances that didn't accuse directly, but waited for you to confirm their suspicions. The NCIS investigation hadn't named anyone publicly, but someone had circulated a version of it. A base bulletin had been issued under the guise of financial conduct awareness. One paragraph stood out among the standard reminders about spending limits and ethics training. It read, "Recent internal inquiries have been initiated concerning fraudulent activity potentially linked to an active duty officer's name being misused in illicit transfers. Cooperation is ongoing." They didn't need to print my name. Not when I was the only officer on base who'd recently been married. The only one whose civilian family had ever interacted with military logistics. By noon, the hallway conversation had gone quiet. Discussion stalled when I walked past. People nodded stiffly, avoided eye contact, or chose longer routes to avoid crossing my path. I wasn't invisible. I was radioactive. I sat through 2 briefings like a phantom. Nobody challenged me when I spoke. Nobody cut me off either. It felt like no one could determine whether I was a liability or a lesson. The turning point came that afternoon in the mess hall. I had selected a table in the far corner. Not to hide, just to breathe. A tray of untouched chicken and rice sat in front of me. My appetite was absent, but the routine still mattered. A young airman approached. Couldn't have been older than 22. He wore his uniform as though it still felt unfamiliar on his shoulders. I recognized him from my logistics class 2 months prior. He stood awkwardly for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Mom." I looked up. "Is it true?" he asked, eyes uncertain. About the fraud situation, the silence around us sharpened. Every nearby table went still. I could have redirected him, told him it wasn't his place, pointed him back to the chain of command. But that would have been a coward's exit, and I'd spent too long staying silent for someone else's comfort. So I nodded once. "It's true they used my name," I said. "It's also true I'm taking it back." He blinked. It wasn't the response he had anticipated, but it was one he could understand. "Thanks, ma'am," he said softly. Then, after a pause, "We've been taught integrity is action. Good to see it demonstrated in real time." He walked away, didn't linger to observe or whisper, just left me with something heavier than shame. Responsibility. And oddly, that moment grounded me. Because even as the rest of the room returned to its meals, something had shifted. A truth had settled quietly but firmly in the middle of rumor and assumption. I didn't govern the whispers. I never would. But I could govern my posture, my choices, my answers. That evening, I stayed late in the logistics office, reviewed the routing systems, rechecked access logs. Each task was a ritual, a way of reminding myself that this uniform still carried meaning, that my name, though bruised, was not broken. Before leaving, I paused at the bulletin board near the exit. Someone had pinned up the same notice from earlier, with certain sections highlighted. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I withdrew a pen from my pocket, stepped forward, and added a single line beneath it in block letters. Your name is only as strong as what you're willing to defend. I didn't sign it. Didn't need to. By morning, they would know. Let them talk. Let them watch. Because I wasn't finished fighting, and I wasn't done reclaiming everything they believed they could take. Coronado's training field was alive with the kind of motion that only elite discipline can produce. Controlled, precise, almost theatrical in its intensity. From a distance, it could be mistaken for chaos. But I knew better. Every pivot, every command, every movement was rooted in structure. Raymond stood near the obstacle course perimeter, clipboard in hand, directing 2 junior SEALs mid-sprint. His posture was identical to what I had seen in combat zones. Alert, authoritative, but never overreaching. That steadiness was what had drawn me to him from the beginning. I waited until the interval whistle sounded before approaching. He turned as though he already sensed my presence behind him. Got a minute? I asked. He gave a brief nod, passed the clipboard to his XO, and gestured toward the perimeter fence where the noise of training softened into wind and ocean. We stood side by side for a moment without speaking. I withdrew the envelope from my uniform jacket. A straightforward form inside. Change of emergency contact. I handed it to him. I removed them, I said. All of them. He didn't open the envelope. Just held it. I'm not certain they'd even answer the phone if it rang, I added. But I needed it documented. For my record. For myself. Raymond finally looked at me. His gaze didn't waver. I never doubted you, he said. Not once. My jaw tightened. Not from anger, but from something closer to grief. Then why did it feel as though you pulled back? He was quiet for a moment. Because I needed to know, he said. If you doubted yourself. I blinked. What? He stepped nearer, lowering his voice. Helena, I've watched good soldiers lose everything because they spent too long protecting people who had no intention of protecting them. I've seen what misplaced loyalty does to capable officers. It corrodes them from within. I swallowed. He wasn't being harsh. He was being precise. You mean you were testing me? No, he said. I was giving you space to choose. Those words landed harder than any accusation could have. I didn't marry a woman who allows blood ties to override what's right. I married a woman who faces a problem and doesn't look away, even when it's wearing her own last name. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice even. I just thought cutting them off would feel vindictive, like I was proving their point. He shook his head. No, you're demonstrating that you have principles and a memory. Loyalty isn't about shared DNA. It's about who remains when the weight falls. I let the silence hold for a moment. Finally, I said, it still feels like a loss. He glanced down at the envelope in his hand. It is a loss, he agreed, but not of you. It's the loss of a hope that they might one day change, that they'd come around. I nodded, and now I know they won't. He folded the form once and placed it in his back pocket. You made the right call, even if no one else sees it that way. I didn't do it for them, I said. I did it so I could look at myself without flinching. Raymond smiled, just barely. There she is. I looked away toward the horizon where the ocean met the base fence line. The air carried the scent of sea salt and dry sweat. Then I turned back to him. Raymond, yeah, if I hadn't stopped it in time, if the documents had been processed, if they connected me to the transfers. They didn't, interrupted. But if they had, I'd have stood with you, he said without hesitation. But I would have expected you to fight. That was his love, not reassurance, not declarations of unconditional belief, but the insistence that I remain who I was, even under pressure. And I loved him for it. Behind us, the whistle blew again. I should get back, he said. I nodded. I'll walk with you. We moved together toward the training area, not as husband and wife, but as 2 soldiers who understood the quiet weight of paperwork, the sharp edges of betrayal, and the cold, steady redemption of doing what is right, even when it costs something, especially when it does. Courtrooms aren't what films make them out to be. No gavel slamming, no raised voices, just fluorescent lights, creaking chairs, and words that carry more weight when they're delivered quietly. The federal hearing was convened in a civilian courthouse downtown, beige and unremarkable, the kind of building you pass daily without realizing that lives are being reshaped inside it. I wore my service uniform, not out of pride, but for clarity. I wanted no ambiguity about who I was or who I was not. Violet sat to the left side of the courtroom in a navy blue suit, not orange. She had accepted a plea deal. 1 count of wire fraud, 1 count of identity theft, 2 counts of conspiracy. The prosecution agreed to drop additional charges in exchange for full cooperation. She pled guilty. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. She never looked at me. The judge acknowledged her cooperation. No prison time, just probation, mandatory restitution, and her name permanently embedded in the digital record of federal fraud. A future of rejected loan applications, denied security clearances, and background checks that would always raise questions. When the gavel fell softly on her agreement, I didn't feel victory, just closure. Then came Will. He had been extradited from Nevada 2 weeks earlier. The marshals brought him in late, wrists in cuffs, chin lifted too high, still performing, still convinced he could charm his way out of it. That confidence had always worked on our parents, on former girlfriends, on unsuspecting employers, but not here. He didn't receive a deal. He attempted to secure one, but the prosecutors had already obtained Violet's confession. They no longer needed him. He pled not guilty. It made no difference. The evidence was overwhelming. Emails, financial transfers, recorded phone calls. One in particular where he laughed and said, "She won't even notice. Helen is too busy saving the world to catch a couple of missing zeros." The judge was less accommodating. 18 months in a federal facility plus full restitution. Not the kind of sentence that generates headlines, but enough. Enough to mark him permanently. Following the sentencing, I walked into the hallway outside the courtroom, heels echoing on the marble floor. Raymond was there waiting, arms folded, leaning against the wall. He didn't speak, just nodded. Then a special agent from NCIS approached, clipboard in hand. "Lieutenant Park," he said, presenting a form. "This is formal confirmation that you are no longer under any form of surveillance or internal review. We appreciate your cooperation." I signed it without ceremony. The final page in a story that should never have been written. As he walked away, I looked down at the signature line beneath my name. I traced it with one finger, not out of vanity, but recognition. They had tried to replicate this, try to make me disappear behind it, but I was still here. Raymond and I stepped outside. The sun was sharp and dry, the kind of heat that clings to your skin. We descended the steps in silence. When we reached the sidewalk, he turned to me. "How do you feel?" I paused. "Tired. Clean. Not relieved, not angry. Just clean." He gave a quiet laugh. "You sound like you just returned from a deployment." In a way, I did. He nodded, then asked, "Any regrets?" I thought about it. "Not revenge," I said. "Just correction." He studied me, eyes level. "They'll carry this with them always." "I know," I said, "but so will I. The difference is mine is recorded in court documents. Theirs is burned into who they are." We walked on. I didn't feel heroic. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt like someone who had completed a task quietly, painfully, thoroughly. The kind of work no one applauds, but everyone benefits from. We passed a coffee shop, a street musician playing soft jazz, a mother pushing a stroller. The world kept moving, and so would I. Because what they had stolen wasn't only my name. It was my narrative, and now I had taken it back, without spectacle, without surrendering who I was. Not revenge, just correction. 3 weeks after the court ruling, I received a letter. Not an email, not a text. A real letter on soft cream stationery. The handwriting unmistakably hers. My mother had always written in a slanted script, elegant and precise at once, as though she needed the world to see she still believed in beauty, even when she couldn't control what surrounded it. The envelope had no return address, only my name written in full. Lieutenant Helena Park. I opened it slowly, uncertain what I was bracing for. Defensiveness, perhaps, or excuses, or silence dressed as sentiment. Instead, it read, "We didn't know, but we allowed it to happen. We observed the patterns, the money, the favors, and we chose to believe it was harmless because accepting the truth meant acknowledging what Will and Violet had become. It meant admitting we had played some part in raising them that way. We hope you can forgive us. And if you can't yet, we understand. Mom, there were no tears. Just a long exhale, a pause, and then stillness. I didn't write back. Not to punish her, but because for the first time in my life, I no longer felt the need to explain myself. Forgiveness is a peculiar kind of silence. It doesn't demand a response. It simply softens the edges of a room, makes what you're carrying a little lighter. That night, I sat in my living room, the letter folded beside me, and let my thoughts drift. Not to the courtroom, not to the wedding, not even to the training field, but to a driveway in Virginia. Summer. Age 13. Violet had shattered the rear window of Dad's truck, hurling a rock during some impulsive moment she couldn't explain. It was loud, glass scattered everywhere. She froze, panicked. I was inside. I heard it. I watched her through the screen door, hands trembling. Without a second thought, I walked outside and told my father it had been me. I took the blame, accepted the grounding, missed the field trip that weekend. Violet cried and embraced me behind the garage. Later that evening, after my father had settled, my mother came into my room and sat at the edge of the bed. She didn't ask questions. She only whispered, "You've always been the strong one." I remember nodding, believing it was something to be proud of. But now, decades later, I recognize the flaw. Strength isn't silence. It isn't absorbing the weight of other people's mistakes to preserve the peace. It isn't offering your name as though it were simply another shield to hand out. Strength is boundaries. Strength is refusing to be used, even by those who claim to love you. I rose from the couch, walked to the bookshelf, and placed the letter in a small wooden box. The one holding my academy pin, Raymond's first deployment photograph, and the coin I received after my first classified operation overseas. Artifacts of transformation. That was what the letter had become. Not a wound, not a scar, but an artifact. Raymond came home an hour later, sunburned and sweaty from outdoor drills. "You okay?" he asked as he set his gear down by the door. I nodded. My mother wrote. He raised an eyebrow. Did she apologize in her own way? Are you going to respond? I don't think I need to. He walked over, settled beside me, and read my expression the way he always could. Good, he said quietly, because not every answer comes in words. We sat together in silence. The kind that feels earned, the kind that doesn't need to be fixed. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere, perhaps, another letter was being drafted. Another apology composed. But I wasn't waiting for it. I had already reclaimed my name, my peace, and my voice. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed anyone, but it was the freedom I chose to give myself. I hadn't touched the kitchen since the wedding. Not because I couldn't bear it, just because it had fallen into a kind of stasis, like a room sealed off in a museum. Intact, undisturbed, waiting for someone to walk in and ask what had happened here. The countertop still held a faint shimmer of champagne residue near the sink. The decorative cake knives, never used, sat in their box. A single navy napkin, one Raymond SEAL teammate had tucked into his jacket pocket during the toast, had been returned and folded on the counter like a forgotten flag. And at the far end, near the bar cart where the gift table had been set, that was where it had sat. The box, the one that had unraveled everything. I took a slow breath, tied my hair back, and began wiping down surfaces. Not aggressively, just with quiet purpose, like reclaiming square footage, not only from the event, but from everything that had lingered after. Beneath the far cabinet, I found a glass ring left by a drink Violet must have rested there. I scrubbed at it, watched it disappear, and then, tucked behind the spice rack, right where the wall dips slightly from old construction, I found a folded note. Thin, almost weightless. To H with love. My breath caught. It was in Violet's handwriting. The card was simple cream. No declaration. Just those 5 words in looping blue ink. For a moment, I didn't move. I simply held in my palm, suddenly very aware of how the light filtered through the blinds, casting angled bars across the counter. I didn't need to open it. I didn't need to read whatever sentiment had been printed inside, if any, because this was their definition of love. A box that could have buried me. A box wrapped with a ribbon and sealed with the assumption that I would stay silent, that I would play the strong older sister again, the one who absorbs and endures without complaint. But I wasn't her anymore. I turned on the oven. Not for dinner. I pulled out the lower drawer, removed the unused broiler tray, and placed the note inside. When a flame took hold, it didn't roar. It didn't crackle. It simply folded into itself like a memory releasing its hold. I stood there, arms folded, watching it curl and vanish. Not from anger, but because the time had come. Behind me, the front door clicked. Raymond stepped into the hallway, kicked off his boots, and called out, "Helena." In the kitchen, I answered without raising my voice. He walked in, pausing as he noticed the cleaner, emptier surfaces. "You didn't have to do this," he said gently. "I know." He caught the faint trace of paper smoke in the air. I didn't explain it. He didn't ask. Instead, he leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "You okay?" I didn't answer right away. I dried my hands on a cloth, set it down, and looked up at him. "Not okay," I said quietly. "Just clear." His expression eased. That was enough. He walked over, kissed my temple, and said, "Clear is good." And it was. Because clarity doesn't mean you're healed. It doesn't mean the betrayal disappears or the trust rebuilds overnight. It simply means the fog has lifted. You see things for what they are. You stop idealizing the people who hurt you. You stop composing speeches they'll never hear. You stop waiting for a different past. The kitchen was clean now. Not flawless, not untouched, but ready. And so was I. It came through at 0600. Not a knock, not a phone call, just a notification in my inbox. Subject line, personnel status update. My heart didn't quicken. That surprised me. I opened it with the same measured precision I would use to disassemble a sidearm. Efficient, deliverit, no ceremony. There were no apologies in the message, no explanations, no acknowledgement that for months my name had existed in suspension, that a career built on years of discipline, sacrifice, and risk had been paused because someone else had borrowed my signature. All it said was status, active consideration. That was it. No fanfare, no expression of regret for the delay. Just 3 words that arrived in my morning like a forgotten appointment suddenly restored. I leaned back in my chair, letting the monitor's light wash across my face. My name wasn't reinstated by ceremony. It wasn't restored through announcement. It was returned in silence. Quiet, official, and permanent. I hit print. The laser hummed softly as the page emerged. I held up to the light briefly, then folded it with care and placed in the file I kept in my nightstand, the one marked private, Lieutenant Helena Park. Inside that folder were certifications, deployment records, commendations, and my commissioning letter. That folder had survived 3 moves, 1 flood, and now this. I closed the drawer. The decision wasn't final. Active consideration wasn't a promotion. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was confirmation that the system had remembered me again. Not as collateral damage, not as a risk profile, but as a candidate, a name worth reconsidering. That afternoon, I went to the base gym. I ran 5 miles on the treadmill, not because I was required to, but because my body still recognized the rhythm of discipline, the steadiness of motion. When the past month had felt unmoored, movement made sense. Afterward, I showered, changed into uniform, and headed to the squadron admin office. The sergeant behind the desk straightened slightly as I entered. "Ma'am," he said. "Just here to update my packet," I said, sliding the printout toward him. He scanned it. His eyes moved from it to me, then back to his screen. Understood. He typed something. I watched the status bar on his monitor advance like a quiet exhale. I turned to leave, but paused at the door. Pinned to the corkboard outside his office were rows of staff photographs, names, ranks, commendations. Mine was there. Second row, neutral background, clear eyes. For weeks, I had imagined it being quietly removed while the investigation dragged on, like a name slowly fading from a roster. But it was still there, still me. I reached out and straightened it. One corner had begun to curl. Then I walked away. That night, Raymond grilled steaks on the patio. The scent of rosemary and heat drifted into the living room as I filled in a journal entry. I didn't usually write by hand, but some things required ink. I wrote. They used my name because they assumed it was passive. because they thought it was something easily reshaped. They believed I wouldn't resist, but I did. I am. Raymond came in carrying 2 plates. You're smiling. I hadn't realized. Promotion board is back on track, I said simply. He didn't ask for more. He just handed me the plate and lifted his glass. To act of consideration, he said. To owning it, I replied. We clinked glasses. No formal toast, just steady resolve. I had never chased medals. I didn't measure my identity by rank, but there was something sacred in knowing that my record belonged to me again, that my name could stand alone on paper without requiring defense. No asterisque, no qualifier, just Helena Park, Lieutenant, United States Air Force. Still standing, still moving forward. It was late Sunday afternoon, the kind of California light that settles gently across your skin as though it's been softened by everything the week has already taken from you. Raymond and I sat on the wooden bench in our backyard, the one he had built from scratch when we first moved in. The cedar had weathered into something silvery and honest, as though it had aged just enough to stop trying to impress anyone. We didn't speak much. He had a beer. I had a mug of mint tea. The silence between us occupied the space as though it belonged there. For a long time, I hadn't known how to simply sit still like this. I'd always been wired for alertness, for forward motion, that trained instinct that keeps your spine straight, your responses sharp, and your attention scanning for whatever threat might be approaching. But now I let my shoulders release. The wind moved through the trees. I watched a finch hop along the edge of the garden bed, utterly indifferent to my presence. I envied that. Raymond glanced over. You okay? I nodded slowly, then said, I expected to feel vindicated. Like I had won something. Like justice should arrive loudly, perhaps even triumphantly. I took a sip and let the warmth settle beneath my tongue. What I feel is something different, I said. It's like air, like I'm no longer carrying it. He leaned back, his expression soft. That's peace, and you earned it. We rested in that. The weight of the past few months had arrived in waves. Grief, betrayal, fury, exhaustion. But this was something different, lighter. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of conflict. My conflict, at least. It hadn't been fought with aggression or intensity. It had been waged with forms, files, and facts. With refusal, with silence used purposefully, with the decision to stop staying silent. They had attempted to turn my steadiness into a vulnerability, my discipline, my consistency, my lack of spectacle. But I hadn't fractured. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't opened their gift. And that had changed everything. I turned toward Raymond. You never pressed me for the full explanation. He kept his eyes on the sky. Didn't need to. I saw in your expression. There was comfort in that. In a love that required no performance, that observed the storm inside you and still chose to remain. Behind us, the sun descended just enough to flood the porch in amber. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's wind chime played a broken, unhurried melody. I closed my eyes briefly. Then, with a quiet breath, I stood. Come on, I said. Let's make something. I think we've earned a real meal tonight. He followed me inside. As the door closed, I glanced back over my shoulder. One last look at the bench, the trees, the stillness that had gathered over everything. And I smiled, because sometimes the most courageous act isn't the one where you raise your voice. It isn't even the decision to push back. It's the choice to stand quietly in the calm and not run from it. They sent me a box of lies. I chose not to open it, and that single decision rewrote everything. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Is it a calm morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late evening where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read every one of them with gratitude. And if this story moved you in some way, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to become part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and the possibility of second chances. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope this story stays with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive with a knock at the door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.